Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this forum event, which is co-sponsored with the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Tonight's lecture is the 9th in a series honoring the life of the late political journalist and historian Theodore H. White. In the audience tonight, we have the presence of Walter Shorenstein, who was the founding idea behind the center, and Daniel Shore, NPR senior news analyst and himself a former Teddy White lecturer. And welcome to many friends of Teddy White who are here and have contributed to this series. Tonight we're lucky to have New York Times columnist William Safire join a very distinguished group of past Theodore H. White lecturers that's included William F. Buckley, Ben Bradley, Cokie Roberts, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Walter Cronkite. Teddy White began his journalistic career delivering newspapers for the Boston Post, and he came to Harvard in 1932 on a newsboy scholarship. His study of Chinese history at Harvard was put to good service when, as a freelance reporter, he witnessed the Japanese bombing of Peking in 1939. And his coverage of East Asia and World War II for Time magazine led to the well-renowned book, Thunder Out of China. He is, of course, also known for his groundbreaking reportage of the presidential campaigns, beginning with The Making of the President, 1960, his book on the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. He was also a member of the visiting committee of the Kennedy School of Government, and in that capacity, he helped to create and design what became the Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy. To introduce tonight's Teddy White lecturer, I'd like to call on Marvin Cobb, the director of the Shorenstein Center. Marvin is the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Press and Public Policy here at the school. He's been at the school for a decade now, after a distinguished 30-year career as chief diplomatic correspondent for CBS and NBC News. He's a popular and highly respected member of our faculty, a man who has authored 2 best-selling novels and 6 nonfiction books. And let me ask you to please join me in welcoming Marvin Cobb.
Thank you very much, Dean Nye. It was March 20th, 1973, and William Safire had a choice. He had just resigned from his speechwriter's job in Richard Nixon's White House. And as he headed for the exit sign, he paused for a moment outside the door of the Oval Office. Should he enter and shake hands with the president one more time? There was always an awkwardness in saying goodbye with Nixon, Safire recalled, so I said the hell with it, passed by the door and continued on out. But supposing he had decided to go into the Oval Office. What he later learned was that a lawyer named John Dean was there at that very moment, telling Nixon that a cancer was growing on the presidency. And if Safire had popped in, Nixon probably would have said, "Sit down, Bill, listen to this. Do you have any ideas?" Safire, who has at least 100 ideas at an unproductive hour, thinks, obviously with 20/20 hindsight, that he would almost certainly have become involved in what ultimately came to be called the Watergate cover-up. In this way, Safire dodged the Watergate bullet and started a brilliant Pulitzer Prize-winning career as a columnist for, of all newspapers, the New York Times. Twice a week, his column called Essay appears on the op-ed page of the Times and over 300 other newspapers, and his other column called On Language appears in the Times Magazine every Sunday, a column that has transformed Safire into the nation's pop grammarian. He is, as Walter Shapiro wrote in Time Magazine, as comfortable with punnery as with punditry. In addition, Safire has written, at least at last count, 24 books, histories, novels, dictionaries, collections of one sort or another. He is a compulsive writer without any plans for calling it quits. "I've got the greatest job in the world," he says. Safire's credo is kick 'em when they're up. He's leveled his big guns at Republicans as well as Democrats, presidents as well as secretaries of state. Nancy Reagan once described Sapphire's columns as vicious and unbelievable. It's safe to say, I think, that Hillary Clinton, whom Sapphire once described as a congenital liar, might share Nancy Reagan's judgment. Question: how does one become a columnist for the New York Times? Not usually the way Sapphire became one. He chose the path of public relations and Republican politics. In 1949, after leaving Syracuse University, Sapphire became a 19-year-old leg man for Tex McCrary, a New York powerhouse who had one foot in journalism and the other in GOP politics. In 1952, Sapphire helped him organize a Draft Ike rally at Madison Square Garden. In 1959, Sapphire arranged the famous Moscow kitchen debate between Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and Vice President Nixon. In 1961, Sapphire started his own public relations firm in New York. He had many Republican clients, among them the former vice president. In 1968, after Nixon's election, Sapphire sold his firm to become a speechwriter for Nixon and occasionally for his vice president, Spiro Agnew, known for two things, at least. First, his slashing attacks on journalists, and second, his embarrassing resignation for financial corruption. Agnew was mouthing Sapphire's words when he denounced TV journalists, including me, I must add, as nattering nabobs of negativism. The Nixon administration's attitude towards journalists was a mixture of hostility and anger, fear and suspicion, an attitude that trickled down from the president himself. This was the time, after all, of anti-war demonstrations, of the Pentagon Papers, of contempt citations against CBS's Frank Stanton, of Woodward and Bernstein, and of talk of impeachment. But it was also the time, ironically, when author Ox Sulzberger of the New York Times, on a flight of inspiration, plucked Sapphire from the Nixon White House to become a columnist for the New York Times. And of course, Sapphire accepted. But when he checked into the Washington Bureau of the Times, he was at first treated like a pariah. After all, his background was not exactly the same as James Reston's. Reporters went out of their way to cold shoulder the conservative voice that Sulzberger felt the Times lacked. Then Nixon, unwittingly no doubt, came to his former aide's rescue. It was disclosed that his White House had wiretapped Sapphire's phone. Suddenly, the pariah seemed like just one of the boys, though he never made Nixon's enemies list. This reputation, plus his bulldogishness, relentless reporting, turned critics into admirers and many, many into friends. Now, according to Stephen Hess of the Brookings Institution, Sapphire comes closer to influencing American policy than any other columnist. But like other columnists, Sapphire can be wrong, even horribly wrong. His hubris way out in front of his judgment. For example, Watergate. Sapphire thought it would be a one-day story. George Bush in the 1992 election, Sapphire was positive he would win. Mikhail Gorbachev, Sapphire was absolutely certain the Soviet leader would never allow the reunification of Germany. Never, he stressed, and so forth and so forth. Playboy once asked Sapphire how he would like to define the meaning of his life. I think I was put here, he answered, to object, to cry, to prod, to challenge, to educate myself and to teach as much as I can, and, he added, to discombobulate. Not just for the sake of discombobulation, but to push my own envelope. Maybe I can do a little good. Our 1997 Theodore H. White lecturer has prodded and discombobulated a succession of administrations, and in the process he has learned and he has taught. His life and work have been rich and rewarding to those who read him with profit and on occasion without doubt fury, and to those who are privileged to be among his friends. So let me introduce my friend, William Sapphire. His topic is our tradition of sedition. Wouldn't you know it? Bill?
First of all, let me get off the bum rap. Marvin gave me a bum rap on this congenital liar business. It was during the blizzard of last year, and I was writing this column about the First Lady. And I came to the deadline, and I started to send on my little modem in my hotel room, and the modem wouldn't work. Andy Glass was not available to teach me how to do it, and I started to panic. But there's one thing that all the columnists have, which is a last resort if your stuff doesn't work, and that is to call the recording room of the Times and to dictate your column, and then they would transcribe it and it comes out in the paper, which I did. And what I said about the First Lady was that she was a congenial lawyer. Well, if you believe that, there's a bridge I can sell you to the 21st century. And next, I'd like to congratulate Marvin Kalb, Professor Kalb, Director Kalb, as they say at the FBI, on the anniversary of Meet the Press. This is the 50th anniversary of Meet the Press. Marvin Kalb was for 7 years the moderator of that great program, and so this is, in a sense, at least a piece of his anniversary. I was on that program. Well, as of now, I do it every month or so, and I come on at the last 15 minutes to shoot the wounded. But I went on long ago, when I had no television experience, with Marvin Kalb. And after the show, I said, how'd I do? And he said, look, sit down, kid. First of all, sit up straight. You're on television, and you're making an impression, so you got to sit up and look alert. And don't start pulling your chin and looking at the ceiling and wasting seconds. Every second costs God knows how much money. And he gave me all this advice, none of which I took. And I've discovered that the trick to being on television is to break all the rules. But if you break all the rules, you're okay. If you break one or two, then you're in trouble. So I owe you a great deal, Marvin, for straightening me out. The story, of course, the classic story they tell about Brother Kalb here, he and his brother Bernard are great fixtures in American journalism. And at one point, they were both working for CBS. And
It's not true.
And
I mean, tell your story.
the whole
but
story.
It's not true.
I think it's true. But it may be apocryphal. Anyway, the story is that Marvin Kalb was more famous than Bernard Kalb, and Marvin and Bernard's mother called one day and said to the operator, "This is Marvin Kalb's mother. Is Bernie there?" No. Which we now know today is not true. All right, now to, I wrote a speech. I'm a speechwriter, and instead of ad-libbing it, I'm going to give it as a speaker would ordinarily give a written speech. This is a great disappointment to all, but we'll see if we can do it. All right, the subject, as Marvin suggested, is our tradition of sedition. One of the most mouth-filling and satisfying words used by irate politicians to denounce a type of journalism that raises questions about their character is scurrilous. I am no stranger to accusations of scurrility. I remember a State Department spokesman, long since forgotten, once denounced a column I did as scurrilous and contemptuous. And when a reporter said, Isn't the word you wanted to use contemptible? The spokesman said, that too. So all those zesty adjectives of outrage, vicious, slanderous, mean-spirited, are as nothing compared to seditious. Sedition in America was, and in many countries still is, a crime. The word is heavily freighted with political oppression. It's rooted in the Latin for tearing apart. It means the stirring up of discontent to the point of inciting rebellion. Sedition is considered by many world leaders today as just one step short of treason. And yet, one of the blessings of America is the home that sedition found in our history. In this Theodore White lecture, I intend to show how sedition, usually accompanied by charges of scurrility, became part of our tradition of free speech. And I want to introduce you to a couple of sedition's patron non-saints and show how they influenced and were manipulated by some of our most revered founders. Now, this is a scholarly dissertation, but it's about scandal and sex, and so stick with it. First, a word about Teddy White, for whom I was an eager source starting in the Nixon-Kennedy campaign of 1960. First thing I think of is his crabbed but legible handwriting. When he interviewed me over the years for the making of the President books, he took notes that he could actually read back later in a notebook that he did not lose. Most of us never get the hang of that. We scribble notes on a variety of papers in a hand that never catches up to what was said, or in a scroll that cannot be deciphered later, or in a file you cannot find. But Teddy, though personally rumpled, was professionally tidy. His notes were sequential and legible and usable. And the way he smiled in appreciative wonderment at what you were saying would give any source a sense of self-importance conducive to spilling one's guts. Teddy White was inclined, as so few of us are today, to give a pal, or even an advocate we now call a spinmeister, the benefit of the doubt. When he erred in judgment, it was on the side of generosity. And you trusted him not to rat on you until after all the dirty deeds were done, and his recounting of your inside stuff couldn't hurt you with the boss. But Teddy was looking for more than an inside story. He wrote that he spent his life in search of history, and he was one of the rare reporters who found it. Scurrility was not his thing. Nobody ever called him a scoundrel, nor did he ever write a seditious word. Yet I'm sure that Teddy would have been fascinated by the vituperators, the prurient purveyors of paranoia. I still got it, right? Who are the heroes of my talk today. I hold that what used to be the crime of sedition, the deliberate bringing of the government into disrepute, the divisive undermining of public confidence in our leaders, the outrageous verbal assaulting of our most revered institutions, is a glorious part of the American democratic heritage. Let me justify that position by telling you in some detail about a couple of seditious journalists who despised each other. These press antagonists are all but forgotten to most students of history, but their examples are central to the tradition of sedition in America. One is William Cobbitt. As a self-educated recruit in the English Army, he wrote a denunciation of the corrupt officer corps, then routinely stealing from the pay of the men in the ranks. Driven out of England by threats of prosecution for that offense to the established order, he came to America in 1792 and at first allied himself with the establishment, supporting George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the pro-British Federalists against Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and the pro-French Republicans. But it wasn't in Cobbitt's nature to support anyone. He was a pioneer in the art of all-out attack and savage ridicule. He was a John Bull who saw red flags everywhere, and in a lifetime production of 10 million words, charged at all of them. Cobbitt called himself a newsmonger, on the analogy of fishmonger, and delighted in infuriating the radical Republican Jeffersonians. When his targets derided him as no better than a prickly porcupine, Cobbitt seized on that name for his daily newspaper, Porcupine's Gazette. He started a near riot by hanging a picture of the hated King George III in the window of his printing shop in Philadelphia. Cobbitt saw the French Revolution, with all its bloody excesses, as a threat to orderly, free government, not only in Britain, but in an America less than a generation removed from revolution. Indeed, he used the word sedition against one of those that he maligned. An early blast of Porcupines was titled Observation on the Insolent and Seditious Notes by the Late French Minister. His newspaper survived and thrived because of the way he wrote, plainly, understandably, making use of colorful metaphor. Even those he abuses read 'em, wrote the English essayist William Hazlitt years later. In England's past, as we all know, there were three estates or power centers that made up the establishment: the king, the nobility, and the church. In writing about Cobbitt's unique influence, Hazlitt coined a phrase about a new power center rising to challenge the others. Quote, "He's too much for any single newspaper antagonist. He bears hard upon the government himself. He is a kind of fourth estate in the politics of the country." The great stylist thought Cobbitt to be mercurial and unprincipled, and he might have added bigoted and cruel. But Hazlitt wrote, "He is not only unquestionably the most powerful political writer of the present day, but one of the best writers in the language." And Cobbitt had a way of intimidating other writers who tried to enliven their prose with awkward figures of speech. "When I see you flourishing with a metaphor," Cobbitt wrote an opponent, "I feel as much anxiety as I do when I see a child playing with a razor." In our formative decade of the 1790s, the Federalists behind Washington and Hamilton and Adams, and the emerging anti-Federalist opposition behind Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, each had its hireling editors and subsidized press. Politicians conscious of their dignity tried not to directly criticize each other. Instead, they egged on their favored pamphleteers and editors. Just this morning, I got a call from the head of the RNC. But the Federalists also had Porcupine, who was on nobody's payroll, but wrote and published the most widely read paper in the new country. President Washington sent a friend what he called, quote, "a production of Peter Porcupine, alias William Cobbitt, making allowances for the asperity of an Englishman, for some of his strong and coarse expressions. It's not a bad thing," end quotes. Washington's opinion changed later when Cobbitt turned on him for overdrawing his salary, and Porcupine speculated, lending it out at usurious interest. The newsmonger had no permanent heroes. To counter Cobbitt, the Jeffersonians had Benjamin Franklin Bache and his Philadelphia Aurora. Porcupine reviled him as young lightning rod, a reference to a famous experiment of Bache's distinguished grandfather. Cobbitt described Bache as an ill-looking devil. His eyes never get above your knees. But that was untrue, as was many of Porcupine's quills. Bache was a worthy opponent of the Federalists, and one of the writers that he employed from time to time is the other newsmonger I want to focus on today. His name is James Thompson Callender, a refugee from libel prosecution in Scotland, and a specialist in scurrility, referred to by generations of eminent historians as that scoundrel Callender. Here's how Cobbitt drew his caricature of Callender in words. A little mangy Scotsman who has a remarkably shy and suspicious countenance, loves grog, wears a shabby dress, and leans his head toward one side as if his neck had a stretch, and goes along working his shoulders up and down with evident signs of anger against the fleas and lice. That's a word picture. But the hungry and often drunk little Scotsman was a better reporter than Cobbitt, or, I submit, any journalist of the day. Callender developed a valuable source and financial resource, the Vice President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who had run second to John Adams in the race to succeed President Washington. Jefferson came to Callender's office above a print shop one day in the summer of 1797, and there's proof of that, to introduce himself and to offer some financial support to a book that Jefferson had heard the writer was finishing. The book was destined to contain a political bombshell. At just about that time, when Jefferson was visiting Callender above the print shop, an ally of Jefferson's named John Beckwith, who was angry at being fired by the Federalists as clerk of the House, leaked some documents to Callender, calling into question the financial probity of Washington's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. It seemed that 5 years before, Hamilton frequently met late at night with and had corresponded with an unsavory character named James Reynolds, who was suspected of using inside information to speculate in government securities. That matter had been investigated secretly by Senator James Monroe, who was a Jefferson supporter, and 2 other members of Congress. They apparently believed at the time Hamilton's explanation. Monroe had given the dossier of damaging letters to a man he identified only as a respectable person in Virginia, probably his mentor, Jefferson. Callender avidly went with the stories that the Anti-Federalists had given him. His book, publishing all the letters of Hamilton and memos of the investigators, made the Federalist Treasury Secretary appear to be corrupt. President Adams was aghast. Hamilton suspected that James Monroe was the leaker, and only the skillful intercession of Aaron Burr, who was then respected by both men, saved the antagonists from fighting a duel. Then Hamilton, the man who was as close to Washington as his son, who had edited out of Washington's draft of a farewell address an ill-tempered diatribe against the press, fired off a broadside at the scurrilous Callender in a pamphlet intended to save his financial reputation. The late-night meetings did take place, the former Treasury Secretary confessed. The documents published by Callender were authentic. But the reason for the secret meetings was rooted not in financial corruption, but in plain old-fashioned sex. Hamilton asserted that he had been having an affair with Reynolds' wife, Maria, sometimes at Hamilton's own home when his wife was away. And when the husband discovered the affair, he demanded that Hamilton pay him blackmail. That explained the transfers of money. He was an adulterer, Hamilton insisted, not a speculator in government securities. Most Americans believed the stunning confession. The delicious details of sexual immorality, which Hamilton was impelled to spell out at great length, marked the end of his ambition to be president, but it saved the Federalists from accusations of corruption. He was a philanderer, Hamilton insisted, but not a crook. Callender was one of the few who did not believe him. He answered Hamilton's Reynolds pamphlet with a pamphlet of his own, arguing that the blackmail story was what he called, and this was his word, a cover-up. But most Americans of the time thought that a politician would be crazy to humiliate himself and to bring shame and dishonor on his family merely to prove himself honest. From that point on, Callender was a marked man, as were some of his anti-Federalist press colleagues. Bache, arrested for sedition, died at age 29 from the yellow fever that decimated Philadelphia. His successor as editor of the Aurora, William Duane, was also prosecuted for that same crime of sedition. To protect himself against the Anti-Alien Act of 1798, which was aimed at the Irish and the Germans, the Scottish Callender hastily became an American citizen. But the Sedition Act of 1798 caught him. That law attempted to stop a two-party system before it took hold. Naturally, it took aim at that portion of the Fourth Estate that acted as surrogate for the emerging opposition party. And here was the law. If any person shall write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or to bring the Congress or the President into contempt or disrepute, or excite against them the hatred of the good people of the United States, the miscreant shall be punished by a fine of up to $2,000 and imprisonment up to 2 years. Well, what about the First Amendment? The Federalists argued that a law against seditious libel did not abridge the freedom of the press any more than copyright laws did. But anti-Federalist James Madison put the question as dramatically as he could. He asked, "Is then the federal government destitute of every authority for restraining the licentiousness of the press and for shielding itself against libelous attacks?" Madison pointed to the Constitution that he helped write and answered, yes, the federal government is destitute of all such authority. But the Supreme Court had not yet asserted its power to declare laws unconstitutional. The Jeffersonians in Congress did manage to get in one provision that truth was a defense against seditious libel, and another that ended that law on the last day of the current presidential term. But most important, by opposing the law, the Jeffersonians gained an issue of principle and could appeal to our revolutionary generation's innate fear of tyranny. President Adams could claim that the new nation was too young for disunion, especially he was trying to keep it out of a war with France. But that great spokesman for American independence could not abide the expression of independent Americans. An angry public reaction to his pernicious Sedition Act hastened the defeat of the Federalists in the next election. And Callender, in this period, all but asked for prosecution. "It is time," he wrote in his Richmond newspaper, "for Americans to cast aside that trimming tone of sycophancy which is too well calculated to oil the wheels of despotism." Campaigning for Jefferson against Adams all the way, Callender was arrested, tried for sedition by the infamous federal judge Samuel Chase, convicted and jailed in June of 1800, and he saw himself as a martyr. What about William Cobbitt while this was going on? The other side got him. A malpracticing physician sued him for libel. The state court in Pennsylvania was in the hands of Jeffersonian Governor Thomas McKean, who was every bit as prejudiced and corrupt as federal Judge Chase. Cobbitt had depicted the governor as a henpecked drunk. The governor's crony was judge, the governor's nephew was the complainant's lawyer, the case was a setup. About the only defender of Peter Porcupine in the press was his longtime ideological adversary, the same James Callender that Cobbitt had scorned as mangy and lice-ridden. "If a man is attacked from the press," Callender wrote, "let him reply through the same channel." Libel, he held, was a weapon of powerful and profligate men who, being unable to meet their accuser on a fair ground of argument and detail, had recourse to law that they might overwhelm him by the expense of litigation. That, of course, is precisely what's happening in Singapore today, and that Singapore model is in danger of being adopted by China. Well, Cobbitt was indeed overwhelmed by the Jeffersonian judge. Chase hit the Federalist editor with the highest fine yet imposed for that crime, $5,000, enough to break Cobbitt financially and send him home to England, railing all the way at the hypocrisy of America's pretense of free speech. Tangentially, at first welcomed home in England, Cobbitt's habit of sedition and his willingness to risk libel ultimately got him into Newgate jail. But as the wheel of political fortune turned, he flipped from establishment to reform and wound up as a member of Parliament. Jefferson, with Hamilton's perverse help, defeated John Adams for president in 1800. One of the new president's first actions in office was to pardon James Thompson Callender and all 13 others convicted under the Sedition Act, which had just lapsed. Callender, as an editor, had delivered for Jefferson mightily, and as a prisoner for 4 months, suffered for Jefferson as had no other supporter. Too poor to support his 4 children, the editor asked for return of his $200 fine, money that he needed desperately, an appointment to a sinecure, the postmaster's job in Richmond. He was stiffed. Callender appealed to Monroe and Madison. Those Virginia gentlemen, always uncomfortable with the lower-class immigrant from Scotland, froze him out. Frustrated, Callender turned up the heat. He pointed out to Monroe, whose packet of documents, you'll recall, had been used by Callender to all but ruin Hamilton, that Jefferson had helped them financially over the years. People did not know that Jefferson, while serving as Washington's Secretary of State, had helped finance attacks on the president's policies. When Monroe asked Jefferson about those payments to Callender, he was told that they had been merely acts of charity, not what they really were, sustenance to a journalist vilifying the men in power. Curiously, Jefferson worried about what he called hush money. Monroe told Jefferson that nobody would believe that charity line and that he would be better off saying nothing, which is what he said. The victorious Jeffersonians made a historic mistake in turning their backs on a loyalist with a hot pen. I once worked for a Rockefeller campaign manager, a wonderful guy named Jack Wells, who used to have a button that he wore on election day that said, "Great job, kid, now get lost." Our disgruntled office seeker Callender, hungry and vengeful, now turned his reporting talents on the ungrateful Thomas Jefferson. As co-editor of the Richmond Recorder, a biweekly, Callender quoted Thomas Paine's dictum that government at best is a choice of evils, and proceeded to expose the evil he saw in the miscegenation practiced by the Virginia gentry. He found private vice behind public virtue, as he condemned the sexual abuse of female slaves by respected plantation owners. That soon turned up a juicy story. Quotes, "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor," wrote Callender about the new president of the United States, "keeps and has for many years has kept as his concubine one of his slaves. By this wench Sally, our president has had several children," end quote. The editor offered no proof, only common report. Quote, "There is not an individual in the neighborhood of Charlottesville who does not believe the story." That revelation about the widowed president's sex life was spread across the country by its 100 newspapers. Most of them couched their reports of every detail in denunciations of that scoundrel Callender, thereby pioneering the journalistic technique of retelling the story by blasting the original storyteller. We've refined it, but there it was. Although most people, and certainly most historians for 2 centuries, refused to believe Callender's gossip, the story of Sally Hemings has scholarly defenders today. Jefferson refused to dignify the charge with a reply and nobody dared ask him about it. But he wrote to his friend Robert Livingston that Callender had embarrassed even his Federalist allies. Said Jefferson, "Every decent man revolts at his filth." Callender was assaulted and beaten with a heavy cane by a Jefferson reporter, but his Richmond paper gained 1,000 subscribers. Under pressure to follow up his account of what he called the luscious Sally, the muckraker spread another embarrassing story. Back in 1792, at the time that Hamilton was convincing Monroe not to go public with that Reynolds accusation, the Treasury Secretary sent a warning to Jefferson that if that story about blackmail and Maria Reynolds came out, so would the story of the Walker affair. John Walker was Jefferson's Virginia neighbor. According to Callender and another editor, when Jefferson was in his mid-20s, he made a pass at Mrs. Walker. She angrily rejected the advances. Later, Jefferson supported Monroe against Walker for Virginia senator, adding political insult to personal injury. The Walkers must have spread the word about Jefferson's lust. Hamilton surely knew about it, and Callender justified his prominent use of the story on the grounds that the public had a right to know the character of men in high office. We now have persuasive evidence that this second Callender report was true. When Monroe and others went to Jefferson to get his denial, thereby to castigate Callender as a salacious liar, the president wrote privately that, quotes, "When young and single, I offered love to a handsome lady. I acknowledge its incorrectness." Credit Jefferson with being a master of language. That was a really graceful way of alluding to an adulterous proposition. He again said nothing in public about the charge. Now, were these attacks by a vengeful editor and office seeker on the moral character of the nation's chief magistrate seditious? Surely they brought him into disrepute. They might have engendered hatred of the government that the president headed, at least in the minds of some of Callender's more avid readers. Fortunately, Jefferson, who had used the popular revulsion at the Sedition Act as one of his levers to power, had no desire to revive it. He won re-election handily in 1804, interpreting that victory in his second inaugural as proof that the artillery of the press, with its demoralizing licentiousness, was no match for the cool and collected judgment of the people. Jefferson rightly reminded his generation and ours that governments demonstrate their strength by tolerating dissent, and that the press should be restrained primarily by the censorship of public opinion. Smarting from Callender's attacks, however, he suggested that others make full use of the salutary coercions of the law in suing false and defamatory publications. That's Jefferson. And what happened to the journalist who had first acted as Jefferson's hatchet man and then later turned into his chief tormentor? Callender's body was found on the banks of the James River one night in 1803, drowned in 3 feet of water. The coroner assumed that he had been inebriated. The judgment of historians writing his epitaph has ranged from, quotes, "the most outrageous and wretched scandalmonger of a scurrilous age," to the more even-handed, "drunken, vicious, and depraved, albeit talented." What happened to the laws against sedition and seditious libel in America? The Lincoln administration jailed its foremost northern dissident, which some people excuse because it was in the midst of a civil war. The notion of sedition reared its head again several times in this century, especially during World War II. A 1918 amendment to the Espionage Act made it a crime to, quote, "willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government of the United States." As World War II approached, the Smith Act of 1940 made it a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, which was used after the war to prosecute communists. The tendency of government officials to protect themselves from the danger of discord was not stopped until the Supreme Court in the 1964 New York Times versus Sullivan enshrined William Brennan's phrase, uninhibited, robust, and wide open in its judgment, adding that political debate, quotes, may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. I see my colleague Anthony Lewis here, who has written a book on the subject and wrote columns about it probably at the time. What can we take from our long and honorable, albeit, I like the word albeit, previously dishonored tradition of sedition? We see that a lip-smacking interest in the sex lives and private finances of our leaders is rooted deep in American history, part of the warping and woofing of our journalistic hounds. Moreover, these were not just attacks in the nascent free press on our founders. These were attacks often stimulated and even authored by our founders and their illustrious hatchetmen. We see from these early examples that the secret leakers often profit while the newsmongers get it in the neck. The polemicist Cobbitt was bankrupted and driven out of the country, and the reporter Callender was jailed and his memory reviled by historians. But a couple of sources whose identity the reporter took to his shallow, watery grave, Beckwith and Monroe, went on to become the first librarian of Congress and the 5th President of the United States. We see, too, the mistake we made in the past of confusing the leaders of government with the government itself. We can be personally disloyal to our elected officials, just as they can double-cross their political followers when they get into power. This has nothing to do with disloyalty to country. Those who are led or refuse to be led, and not those who do the leading, are the sovereign power. But what about good taste? Isn't scurrility awful? And doesn't an obsession with the private character of candidates demean our national character? Yes, it is, and sure it does. But tastes differ. One person's meaty story is another person's poisonous invasion of privacy. When the criticism gets destructively caustic or unpleasantly sharp, or when some people's appetite for salacious detail leads to invasion of privacy and entrapment, then we should turn, as Jefferson suggested, to the censorship of public opinion, which is manifested in not buying a newspaper or in turning off that channel. Callender had some good advice. If there were no buyers, there could be no sellers. Sedition is not scurrility. It has little to do with good taste. Sedition is the law that gags the bringing of government into disrepute, and the passage and enforcement of such law is as disreputable an act that any government can commit. For disrepute should come to those who act disreputably, and its cause should not be laid at the door of those who expose that act. The government that relies on sedition law to protect itself, and there are many powers that do so today, is weak. The government that grimly tolerates the seditionists demonstrates its strength and stability. In a nation that was just beginning to learn that opposition did not mean disloyalty, James Thompson Callender called the weapon he wielded the hammer of truth. His anvil was whoever was in power. Thanks to Callender, Cobbitt, and the often vindictive, wrong-headed, and unfair journalists who established the tradition of sedition in America, today that hammer rings out loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill Sapphire, for fascinating insights into American history and the role of the press in early American history. Mr. Sapphire has agreed to take questions. We have 4 microphones set up. There are 2 down here and 2 up in the balcony. If you'd like to ask a question, come up to the microphone now. And the idea about asking a question is that you ask a question, nice and brief, and Mr. Sapphire will then take the answer. Why don't we start right here, young lady? You can identify yourself, too. That would be helpful.
Sure. My name is Joanne Fan. I'm second year at Kennedy School. I actually like to touch upon a little bit on foreign affairs, which I know you're very well versed. The U.S.-China policy had long been governed by the One China policy, and recently the People's Republic of China has shifted the long-held statement of Taiwan is part of China to Taiwan is part of the PRC, and this position has been seriously rejected by the Taiwanese government. Why do you think that the suspicious media has not caught the hidden significance of this tension, given that President Jiang Zemin has just been here, and that this might be the People's Republic of China's deviation from this One China policy?
The One China policy was cooked up by Henry Kissinger in the Shanghai Communique with Zhou Enlai. And it was a brilliant move where they could agree on something that both understood differently. And so when Taiwan said there's one China and we are China, and the communists said there's one China and we're it, we could say essentially, you're both right. And there is one China. And who it is, we're going to leave for you guys to work out. That has been the basis of our policy. And it's a pretty good basis when you think about it. We don't take sides in what would be an unequal struggle. And I think that the most important thing that we did was when the PRC made an effort to rattle its scabbard with a military threat to Taiwan. President Clinton, to his credit, sent in the fleet to just parade around to show that we are serious about the essential, which is not the trappings of a one China policy, but the essential, which is don't fight and reach a peaceful conclusion. So to that extent, I think the media have been, I construe media as plural, the media have been fairly adept at understanding it, and particularly good, really, I think, in calling to the president's attention and discomfort the human rights violations in China. I don't know if that answers your question, but that evades it my way.
Hello, my name is Philip Cunningham. I'm a Nieman Fellow. And I hope you won't be insulted if I ask you a question that I intended to ask President Jiang Zemin when he came here this weekend, but I didn't quite get the question out. I was shouted down by the moderator. It was reported in the Times as I was described as a protester, and the Harvard Gazette has a transcript of that today. But the question I'll change it a little bit for you because you're not responsible for putting Wei in jail, but who is Wei Jingsheng? You've written about him a lot. Why should we care about him, and what can we do to help people like him?
Well, Wei Jingsheng is an electrician who came up with the idea of the democracy wall 16 years ago and was jailed for 14 years. He is the equivalent of Andrei Sakharov. And when he was out of jail, an assistant United States Secretary of State, John Shattuck, met with him. As a result of his meeting with a high U.S. official, he was rejailed. For this reason, and for this reason without going into all the human rights ramifications, the United States was profoundly insulted that someone meeting a United States official should be jailed for that crime. That was followed by, I think, the absolute craven action by the Nobel Prize Committee to continue to ignore him. They could possibly save his life by giving him the Peace Prize. Instead, they gave it to the landmine lady. Well, it's easy to stick your thumb in the eye of the United States, but it's much more difficult to stick your thumb in the eye of the PRC. And I think that those of us who felt very strongly about the jailing of Sakharov and Sharansky, and were derided at the time by the geopoliticians who said, you're just upsetting détente. Well, it turned out that a combination of the stress of an arms race plus the cracks within the Soviet Union led by the dissenters changed history. And I think our focus on our, forgive the expression, Jeffersonian principles in our dealings with China, we're not necessarily containing them or treating them as a new Soviet Union or evil empire, but putting the pressure on expresses what we are all about, and indeed, with some subtle diplomacy on the side, can help the dissidents and the people who believe in free speech in China.
Thank you. Take a question up there, please.
Hi, my name is Matthew Green. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And in the definition of sedition that you read to us a few moments ago, it included the word false, as in false, libel, etc. My question is, how do you compare or balance or weigh the value of the constructive scurrilousness and sedition that you described here tonight versus responsibilities toward complete factual accuracy and intellectual honesty in writing a newspaper column or anything?
In the tradition of sedition, 250 years ago and 200 years ago, truth was the defense against libel. And that was the way it was until relatively recently, when it became, when that changed, when a report could be unintentionally inaccurate and used to break a newspaper. And the chilling effect on small newspapers, not the New York Times and the Washington Post, which has money to defend itself, but on small newspapers, would be to say, don't run anything controversial that you can't absolutely prove. And so the necessity to prove the truth of what you say has been removed. And now it is effectively impossible to try anybody for the crime of sedition in America, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling in '64 and then again in '69 in Brandenburg. And if you want to further follow up on that, you might ask Anthony Lewis.
In the balcony, please.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Sosnowick. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Mr. Safire, I'm just curious, there's been some recent criticism of the two-way door that is occurring between the press and politics and how easily journalists move in between the two areas. And having spoken of the hammer of truth, I was curious what your comments on that door and the way that people go in and out might be.
David Broder and I disagree completely about this. He feels that the virginity of journalists is sullied or broken by going to work in government, and then, even worse, coming back on television in a food fight as a commentator. I don't see that at all. I like the idea of so many of us I started out as a journalist, as a legman in the Herald Tribune, and then I went to work as a politician, and managed to stay out of jail and came back into the reporting world. Now, when I read a press release or listen to a White House spinmeister. I can hear the preparations for that press release, and that it takes one to know one, and I can see through it, and I can watch some of the qualifiers skillfully slipped in so you can hardly see them. And I was there, and I know those qualifiers. So the experience of being on the inside helps you on the outside. And there's a difference between objective reporters and opinion-mongering columnists. There's no trouble at all with a opinion-mongering columnist having been an insider in politics. Now, when it comes to look at Tim Russert. He was Mario Cuomo's and Moynihan's aide. Now he's the adversary of whoever comes on, left or right, on Meet the Press. And look at me, I happily take pops at both sides, and indeed get some of my greatest satisfaction out of savaging my own kind.
Question.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rosenberg, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. 30 years ago, people used to have faith in government institutions. Today, outside of the Kennedy School, most people don't. And I think that makes it very difficult for anybody in government to accomplish anything. And I think in order for dramatic change to happen in America, people have to have faith in government again. And given the history of sedition in America, how will that occur again? And how will the press play a role in helping to make that happen? If all the stories are always negative and predominantly negative, what are we going to do?
Precisely why I made the speech.
Okay.
To show that the institutions, and indeed the memory of the leaders, can withstand the most savage, scurrilous, mean-spirited attack. And the cool, collected judgment of the people in the long run, combined with a golden haze of memory, has a way of re-legitimizing government. So if we err on the side of suspicion, we are going up against the government that always has an edge on us in secrecy and can slam down the door and not, if you'll pardon the expression, answer all the subpoenas. And so the contest between the free press and a free government, and it is a contest, that tension is to be gloried in. And if it upsets some people who can't take it, as Harry Truman said, get out of the kitchen.
Question, please.
Good evening, Mr. Sapphire. My name is Anish Venkatraman. I'm a freshman at the college. I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. My question is, a lot of the sex stories that you spoke of have manifested themselves into the tabloid journalism of today. As a writer for what is considered to be the pillar of respectable journalism in our media, I was wondering if you could comment on the attraction and the rise of popularity of tabloid journalism and what you see as the future of respectable journalism and whether its days are numbered.
Respectable journalism is a oxymoron. Somewhere in here I had that quote from Callender that essentially said, if there were no buyers, there would be no sellers. And I think that one of the greatnesses of the American media is that it has a National Enquirer and a New York Times and a sense of local news saying if it bleeds, it leads, and a sense of some responsible, if you'll pardon the expression, television journalists. I'm looking at one right here with his gray hair, Dan Shore, who fearlessly and the fearlessness carries over into the courage to occasionally be dull and talk about dull subjects like Bosnia or NAFTA or things that don't have to do with a trial. So there's a place in American society for both the scurrilous and even pornographic, in some cases, expressions. Somebody said to me recently that I want to buy a pornographic CD record. And I said, I'd love to, but I don't have a pornograph. But in serious answer, the multiplicity of the media is the safety that the people have.
In the balcony, question.
Hi, my name is Douglas Stewart. I'm in the English department here. I just have a small point to make about the Fourth Estate. And I just have a quote here from 1762, actually, where the term is used. It's by an author named J. Marriott in a book called Political Considerations on the Present Crisis. And he writes, "In such times it is very dangerous to create and introduce a fourth estate, as it were, of a democratical kind into the Constitution, and which is therefore more liable in its nature to be played off as an engine against government by the arts of any able set of men who have a private interest in inflaming others not quite as wise as themselves." Just that the term is current. In England in the 1760s, I had the impression that you suggested that it had just come into usage a little later. So,
Marvin, you come to Harvard, you learn something. I was persuaded that the term the Fourth Estate, and I'm a political etymologist, was coined by Hazlitt in 1832. If you have a citation from the 60s, I'd like to have it. So would the Oxford English Dictionary, and you will straighten us all out.
just give me your address.
All right. Please. Excuse me, the address is the New York Times Washington Bureau in Washington.
Professor Kendall.
My name is Kathy Kendall. I'm a fellow at the Shorenstein Center. I had a question about the presidential primaries. You were working for Eisenhower in 1952, and in February 1952, Eisenhower was in Europe, and he was the head of NATO, and never came back during the primaries till the very end. I wondered if you could reflect back about that work that you did with Tex McCrary. I think that was a very interesting passage where Eisenhower, though he wasn't even in the country, was quite successful in the primaries, and some of the work that you did with McCrary for Eisenhower.
Well, just briefly, Taft was going out to win the Republican nomination. A bunch of, well, we didn't call ourselves, I guess we called ourselves liberal Republicans at the time, in the Northeast, wanted somebody to carry the banner. Both the Democrats and the Republicans wanted Eisenhower. So Eisenhower would not commit. He wanted to see a groundswell before he, and just the pundits talking didn't impress him as a groundswell. And so we put on a rally at Madison Square Garden and filled it with 18,000 screaming people calling for Ike. And we got Irving Berlin to write a song, I Like Ike. And we made a video, not a videotape, a kinescope recording, and had the aviatrix, that's when you could use those sexist words, Jacqueline Cochran fly it over to SHAPE headquarters and play it. And there, for the first time, Eisenhower could see the people. He didn't know that we were, we got them by busloads and brought them into calling out for him, and that enabled us to get him to agree to run in the primary. And, but I was very young.
We have time for two more questions here and in the balcony. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Alexander Thier. I'm a student at the Fletcher School up the road. Thanks for the delightful speech. Something that's often been referred to, I think, is the liberal paradox, which is that a government which allows free speech may also ultimately allow speech which can also be interpreted as actions that could bring about its undoing. A much more recent example could be somewhere like Algeria, where the election of Islamic militants would allow the government no longer to have elections. Just wondering what you think about the limitations of free speech in light of that.
I'm an absolutist on that, and a libertarian. I just think that the nature of a society is such that if it must repress a democratic decision, then it's too weak to exist. If it enforces democracy by tyrannical means, it's a tyranny. So the only thing you can do is let some weak democracies slip under. And in the few instances when you do, it's certainly outweighed by all the instances where you defend the right of people to advocate the overthrow of the government, provided that they don't say, in the next 3 minutes, pull a gun and shoot somebody. That's the only limitation on free speech.
Last question in the balcony, please.
There's two more people here.
I'm aware of that. Thank you very much for coming. The balcony, please.
Hi, my name is Simon Cox. I'm at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. You say that censorship should lie with public opinion expressed through the decision not to buy. I was wondering how those market signals could ever be discriminating enough to constrain writers, given that a newspaper is a bundle of many different articles which people buy for many different reasons.
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry. Say it again.
You said that the best form of censorship is people's decision not to buy a paper.
Right.
People's decisions not to buy a paper are made for many different reasons, and I was wondering how those decisions could ever get the message through to writers to constrain their writing. Given that people will continue to buy papers out of habit, given that a paper includes many different articles.
Well, you assume that the good end is the triumph of respectability in journalism and the end of all scurrility. And I say it's not in the cards, and it's not in our tradition, and look, I like the New York Times. I don't like some of the entrapment tabloid, but I don't dictate American taste. I just dictate, right-wing, certain crowd taste. But I'm for the diversity of media, and I don't presume to dictate what people's tastes are in other publications. And if I can conclude, Marvin, I'd just like to say that a lot of us in journalism read the publications that come out of the Kennedy School here. And keep making that slip. But seriously, the publications that come out of the Kennedy School are read, are well circulated, and a great many of us in journalism are particularly proud that one of our graduates, Marvin Kalb, crossed the street to academe and has done so remarkably well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow morning between 9:30 and 11:30, upstairs in the Malcolm Penthouse, we're going to continue our discussion of our tradition of sedition. And William Safire will be joined by Pauline Meyer, a professor of American history at MIT, by Justice Margaret Marshall, Associate Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, by Daniel Shore, Senior News Analyst of National Public Radio, and by David Shribman, the Washington Bureau Chief of the Boston Globe. And we're going to discuss what it is that Bill Safire talked about tonight, I think, with extraordinary eloquence, providing us with great insight into a very important theme. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Really terrific. Oh, thank you.
Enjoyed having dinner. Look forward to another visit from you.
And tomorrow be with us?
Yeah, fine, make sure you get the right thing.
Excuse me, to the program.
Yes,
9:30 to 11:30.
right upstairs.
Okay, thank you very much.